Well, hello to everyone. A warm welcome from Cologne to all participating alumni in our third KölnAlumni Weltweit DigiTalk event, joining in from all over the world. My name is Christiane Biel, and together with my colleague Alexandra Tauer, we will guide you through this session on this late afternoon, at least late afternoon here in Cologne. And we are looking forward to a very interesting talk and discussion today. Just one sentence on KölnAlumni Weltweit. It's a project initiated by the International Office here in Cologne to offer all former international students, graduates, and scholars the possibility to keep in touch with the University of Cologne and to become part of an international alumni network. Well, due to COVID-19, we, like so many others all around the world this year, had to cancel our yearly summer school, alumni summer school. And we sat down and reflected on what we could do to offer some formats to keep in touch with our alumni. And one idea was to organize these DigiTalks. And we started out in July with Joanne Halpern. She is the founding director of the German Center for Research and Innovation in New York. And she gave a talk to our alumni on building your international career. And that was followed in September by a talk by Janine Steger, who gave a presentation on going green and thereby dealing with sustainability and everyday life, so everyone can make a check how sustainable and green is my own daily life and what can I do. And for the third talk, we felt that it would be a good idea to include an international partner institution into that alumni talk. And Allegheny College in Pennsylvania has been a partner institution since 2012. We do have a lively exchange of students, and in addition, we are also able to send German teaching assistants every year to Allegheny College, who's then assisting a professor in the German department over there. And my colleagues from the International Office at Allegheny College, Lenny McCandless and Lucinda Morgan, will in a few seconds say a few words on the exchange. And we also have a couple of sentences from our teaching assistant, Felix Kirchhoff, who's actually now present in the US and is thereby one of the few, I would say, the only exchange students we have in the winter term over in the US. So thank you for being here, being there, and being here today. And so there are a lot of links between our institutions, and Alexandra, who's now working as a trainee in the International Office, was also a former teaching assistant at Allegheny College. And she is the person who established the link to today's speakers. Having said that, a very, very warm welcome, Professor Zachary Callen, professor at the Department of Political Sciences at Allegheny College. He will reflect on the so far outcomes and implication of the US presidential elections. And it is really a coincidence that we invited a speaker from Pennsylvania. Probably many people, of course, in the US and all over the world are now closely following what is happening in your state and are awaiting the voting results that may turn out to be very decisive in these elections. So it's a coincidence, but we are very happy that we can have this now at 5 o'clock here with you. Having said that, I will turn over the floor to my colleagues in the International Office at Allegheny College to say hello and yeah. Where are you? There you are.
Thank you, Christine. We're so glad to be with all of you this morning and this afternoon, evening there in Germany. And thank you for the great work that your colleagues have done putting on the digital series this way, and we're happy to be part of it with you. My name is Lucinda Morgan. I'm the director of the International Education Office at Allegheny College. And Lene McCandless is our assistant director, also in the session here this morning. And we are just thrilled to have the relationship with Cologne and being able to have the exchange students each semester and each year back and forth, and the teaching assistants every year. And it's great to see some familiar faces. Of course, Alex, and then it looks like Severin and Rebecca are also in the session here. So good to see you after a year or two away from Allegheny that way. So it's just wonderful to be able to do this together and then to incorporate it into the academic discussion that Professor Callen will lead here just in a little bit about the American political system and the presidential election. So we are always welcome and welcoming and wanting to have more students from Cologne at Allegheny. So if that's something of interest, either through the exchange program or the teaching assistant program, definitely reach out to our international offices, and we're happy to talk more with you about that. Lene, do you want to say a few words?
Hi everyone, my name is Lene McCandless. I'm the Assistant Director of International Education at Allegheny. I have to say hello to Severin and Rebecca and everybody, Alex, Tyler. It's so great to see a lot of your faces. I work with our incoming exchange students, but also outgoing students to Cologne. And I work very closely with our TAs too to help facilitate their arrival at Allegheny. We love our partnership. We love the students that we receive from Cologne, and our students have a wonderful time when they go to Cologne. So we're very happy to be celebrating that a little bit today and welcoming Professor Callen on such an important day in our country and especially in our state, as Christian mentioned. So if you have any questions at all about our exchange program at any point, like Lucinda said, please contact us, and we're very excited to be here today with you all. So I'm going to pass to Felix, our current TA in the German department at Allegheny College.
Hello from my side. I'm Felix Kirchhoff, as just said, the current TA here at the Department of Modern and Classical Languages. I teach German twice a week in small groups at live labs with focus on language practice and also like cultural exchange. And besides, I organize like smaller or bigger events. We just had a Oktoberfest Corona edition, so everything was a little different, and organize German movie nights, for example. And yeah, besides that, I also study 2 courses per semester here. And so far, I'm having a really great time and happy to be at Allegheny.
Yes, thank you. And I also see Professor Ludewig here on my screen. Hello. That's actually the German professor, in the German department at Allegheny. Thank you for having all our TAs with you, and thank you for being here today. And yes, so having said that, I think now we turn over the floor to our speaker, Professor Zachary Callen. Just 1 or 2 hints to the organization. While we are listening to the talk, you can write your questions into the chat function, and Alexandra and I will collect them, and they will be answered afterwards. And once we do have, after the talk, an open Q&A session, if you have a question, please show up by clicking onto the blue hand. And last but not least, this DigiTalk is going to be recorded and will be uploaded on our website afterwards. And now, Professor Callen, the floor is all yours. We're very curious what you have to say.
All right, well, thanks. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to you. It's afternoon for you, it's morning here. So right now, I'm excited to talk to you right now.
Wait, is it the afternoon there?
Yes.
Why?
Just somewhere else. So I have some things prepared to sort of say. It sort of bounces around a little bit. You know, I don't have a real coherent thesis. I just have some points that I want to sort of put out there and make. I will leave lots of time to take questions or have discussion. I think that's probably the most interesting and sort of important part anyway. And so that's kind of where sort of I'm at right now. So I think what I want to point out and start with is just sort of like how voting works in the American context, and that maybe voting isn't particularly easy in the American context. So I'm not sure what kind of voting systems you're familiar with or how familiar you are with the American system in particular, but it's like not always easy to go vote in America. So for instance, you have to register to vote, right? So, you know, I know like in some countries, in some states too, in the United States, it varies. So election law also varies a lot from place to place, from state to state. But you have to register to vote. So some number of weeks before the election, you have to turn in a form that says, hey, I'm a citizen, this is where I live, I'm of legal age, let me vote at my polling place. And that the deadline for that might be weeks before the election. So you have to really be aware and be on it Now, some places in the United States do have same-day registration, right, where you can sort of show up and register. You say, I'm going to vote today. Let's go. But that's not the norm, really. There have also, maybe you've seen in the last week or so, last couple of weeks, we have early voting in the United States. So people can vote days or weeks before the election. That often huge long lines people to vote. So there's probably questions of like, are there enough polling places to vote? At each polling place, are there sufficient number of voting booths or polling stations so you can, you know, clock your vote in? It looks like probably there are not, right? It's way too hard to vote. I'd also point out that election day, although you can vote again early or request an absentee ballot, there sort of are bounded hours to voting in the United States. So it starts at a certain time early in the morning. It ends at a certain time. That varies from state to state. 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. is when it ends. Again, varying from place to place. But it's not a holiday here, election day, right? Some places, election day is a holiday. So you get off work, you can go vote. That is not the case here. You need to sort of work around your sort of schedule that day. Your workplace should let you go vote, but that's not always accommodated in the way that it should be. So like, what does that mean? Well, first off, we should note that there's a long history of this that's sort of part of American politics, right? Voter suppression, and we'll talk more about sort of this sort of part of American politics a little bit towards the end, but voter suppression is very much part of American politics. And we know this most from the United States in the post-Civil War period, so the late 19th into the middle part of the 20th century, and in some ways still today, right? We had things like poll taxes, so you had to pay a fee to go vote, the grandfather clause, literacy tests, right? There was a whole sort of range of tests that were developed to stop people from voting, and in particular to stop Black people from voting, right? And so that's very much like part of how elections happen here. What that means is that political parties or political organizations, activist groups have to think really hard about how they're going to register, connect with, and then turn out voters, right? That's sort of like a really sort of important part of the strategy, really sort of, hitting the street, like, hitting the pavement and, connecting with voters very directly, one-on-one or in small to medium-sized groups, getting lots of people registered, and then getting lots of people to sort of turn out. I lived in Chicago for a while, and once in a while on election day, there would be cars driving around from political parties that were like, need a ride to the polls? Need a ride to the polls? They're sort of blaring, out their car windows, or they have like the megaphone, trying to pick people up and sort of get them to show up and vote. In the context of this election, this has been particularly important in places like Georgia and Texas, right? So right now, Georgia is like a toss-up, neck and neck. It's not clear who's going to win. President Trump did win Texas, but right going into the election, it was a toss-up, right? And Biden did make gains in Texas compared to 4 years ago. And that's because of the work of sort of activists and sort of local or regional political leaders. So Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who ran for governor a couple of years back and was defeated in part by voter suppression efforts, right? As soon as she lost, then she made it her sort of mission to basically register and turn out even more voters. In Texas, you had Beto O'Rourke, who ran for the president. He ran for Senate there, and he ran for the president, and he dropped out pretty early in the Democratic primaries. He's the guy who's famous for being like sort of young and cool and hip, and he like rides a skateboard and likes punk bands and stuff like that. Some folks like him, some folks find him a little bit insufferable. That's your call. But in the last year or so, he's been really active in Texas again, trying to get people to vote, register to vote, turning them on to the political process. The Castro brothers, right? Julian Castro ran for president as well. He and his brother were also, right, in Texas doing a lot of legwork, right, trying to get people registered to turn out the vote. And so you can see that this turnout matters. And I think it also matters in the context of doing this sort of on the ground kind of ground game, we might call it, work, is that we start to realize how diverse and complicated voters are in the American context. So the United States is a really big country, right? It's like physically the meaningful part of a continent, right? It's just a lot of territory, and it covers a lot of economic, geographic, and racial diversity. And so even within that, as we try to slice the American population up into groups, we can always slice it finer. And so there's, been a lot of talk, for instance, for years now about the Latino vote. And you're right, there's this growing Latino population, and how do we turn them out, and who are they going to break for? Maybe they'll break Republican because they're very Catholic and more conservative sort of culturally. Maybe they'll sort of break for Democrats because they work a lot of service sector and sort of, right, working class jobs. They're also sort of not white. So, the sort of civil rights positions of Democrats might sort of make sense too. And so there's like this, and not that long ago, right, there was a real effort by both parties to court Latino voters. So like when the second George W. Bush ran for president, a big part of his campaign was things like amnesty for people who were in the country, right, illegally, right? He was sort of explicitly trying to appeal to Latino voters. Sort of, he ran as a compassionate conservative. He had been governor of Texas, so he had a lot of connections with the Latino community. And it seems like when President Trump ran for office 4 years ago, that was not so much a part of his approach, right? He talked about sort of immigrants from Mexico as sort of murderers and rapists. And I don't think he was doing a lot of outreach to that group. And then, of course, there was the sort of putting folks into the cages that happened in the last, year or so, 18 months, that stuff started to come to light. And again, these didn't seem like big get out the Latino vote efforts, though in the last about 6 weeks, the Trump organization did make a lot of pushes there. But where this is going, this issue of sort of diversity, voter turnout, getting on the ground, is one thing that's interesting is how the Latino vote that we think of as this unit, this entity, is not that at all. There are Latinos from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, from Mexico, from Guatemala, Venezuela, El Salvador, other places, of course, right? A whole sort of host of countries. And they have like lots of different experiences, lots of different interests, different cultural and different sort of political socializations, or different backgrounds. And so they're not, just because they sort of, all speak Spanish, because they all come from Central America or South America, it in no way means that they are the same, have the same interests, or even the same perceptions about political issues. And so, right, American politics, I think as we see in this election, presents parties and candidates with these sorts of challenges. How do you get the people who want to vote for you prepared to vote? So, right, how do you get them registered, paying attention, know where their poll place is, know what day election day is, when the polls are open, and how do you sort of look at that sort of complicated sort of pile of voters and figure out how to appeal to all these little subsets of voters, right? What are the issues they care about? What are the cultural signals that you can say and that you understand them, right? There's like a lot you're trying to do, but you have to do it because, of course, turnout is what wins elections. You get people to show up to vote. So I think that we see happening a lot in this particular election. I think we should talk about money. I think money is the other thing that we talk about because it's also tied to turnout, or we think that it's tied to turnout. And I think the truth is that we don't know a lot about how money works in electoral politics, right? We know you need some money in electoral politics. You need office space and equipment. You need signs and t-shirts. You need staff. You have to, run commercials, right? All those sorts of things have to happen. But the question is like, how much can money really buy you? How many votes can it buy you? Particularly if you're not doing those kinds of voter turnout things that you need to do in order to really win an election.
Can I have a snack?
And so we see this in like lots of places here right now, right? Like there was a ton of money spent in the state of Kentucky to try to elect Amy McGrath, to sort of knock off Mitch McConnell, who was a Republican senator and right is sort of the head of the Senate right now, right? And she got like a third of the votes, right? I mean, talking like just like tons and tons of money poured into that race because people really didn't like McConnell, but McGrath was, although on the surface seems like a strong candidate, sort of a centrist Democrat, military background, right? Seemed like a real, like, you know, like she would appeal to moderates, and it just never really connected, right? She never connected with voters in a meaningful way. Similarly, in South Carolina, in an effort to unseat Lindsey Graham, a ton of money poured into that race that looked very close in the days up to the election, something else we'll talk about a bit later, and then was not, right? And Graham on Tuesday night had pretty clearly sort of won that race. And so I think money, like this has been a very expensive election cycle. And our election cycles have increasingly in the United States gotten more and more expensive. But it's not clear how it matters. Trump, you know, is still in this race, and they were a pretty broke organization by the end of the campaign. Biden was flush with cash, and you know, it's been a bit of an uphill battle, it seems, right? We'll see what the final counts are, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, Biden has done very well, right? Pushing Arizona and Georgia so far, doing so well in Texas, right? Flipping back two states that Clinton lost in 2016. So maybe the money did matter. I think it's an interesting question to think about how much money matters, right? It might depend on the context of the election too. This is an election where almost most voters had their minds made up very early. In 2016, Clinton-Trump, there was a lot of undecided voters. You had two candidates that weren't super popular, you know, they were perceived as flawed, I think, by a lot of voters. And so their money might have mattered more, right? Getting the message out there, building that name recognition, building that relationship with voters. There's a lot of money in presidential politics, in presidential years. And I think it's probably something that is worrisome. You know, I think there's, you know, even if it doesn't have a huge effect, you worry in a close election how the presence of so much money is tilting things one way or another. I think the third thing I want to talk about today, at least briefly, is polling and what's going on with polls right now. Now, I am not a polling expert. It's not what I study. It's its own complicated sort of wizardry and math that I don't sort of fully understand. But I think a lot of folks are talking right now about, was the polling good or was the polling bad? I think these are really important questions. And what we do with polls, how we use them. I would imagine it's a little harder to poll people these days. The sort of gold standard of polling has historically been random digit dialing. So if you're a pollster, like, the idea of a poll, of course, is that you want a representative sample. So you want a sample of people you call, 1,000 to 2,000 people. It could be less sometimes, depending on your methods, that sort of reflect the nation in terms of their demographics, their culture, their political beliefs, all that sort of stuff. And for sort of a time period that coincided with the rise of polling, because polling depended also, really good polling depends on computers, right? You need a way to parse a lot of data really quickly. That happened to coincide with some advancements in psychology, right? The best ways to do this kind of work, to ask these questions, to develop good questions that don't lead people or that get to what you actually care about, that are reliable and valid. And also, you need to have access to almost every person in the country basically equally. Everyone had to have about an equal chance of being pooled into your survey. And the best way to do that is the telephone, right? You just dial 10 random numbers, and if basically everyone, rich, poor, black, white, north, south, east, west, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Hindu, whatever, has a telephone, then they'll probably answer it. And you probably need the sweet spot of no caller ID, where people answer their telephone all the time, right? And so you can imagine sometime in like, I don't know, the late 60s to like the early 90s, having this run of pretty sort of good, solid polling. But it's harder now, because like, when's the last time you answered your telephone at all, right? Especially if there's a number you didn't know on the screen. So they're real questions. Now, people have found ways around this by like weighting the samples they get using sort of demographic data, what we know about voters from like political psychology and economics. So bringing in social science disciplines to sort of beef up the sort of raw polling data. But the polling data this time is really complicated. You know, Biden was shown as having a really large lead nationally, 8 to 10 points. He was shown as leading by several points in a few states. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was one of them, having a tighter but seemingly doable lead in places like Florida, Arizona, Nevada that are now, he lost Florida. The other two are really tight. On the other hand, if he wins Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Arizona as predicted, the polls were off, but they got the final result right, which means maybe they were pretty good, or maybe because polls are just probabilistic, they have wiggle room. I think what this starts to come to is we have to start asking ourselves what polls are for and how much we should rely on them, and more broadly, how much they change the race themselves. And there's been some sort of research on this, you know, about the kinds of questions we ask, how we report back the results. And, you know, it could be that even the presence of polling changes the electorate. It makes them pay attention to some things more than other things, right? It's just sort of like it alters the way they understand the issues, right? That polling is sort of part of the political process. It's not outside, right? It's not outside. It's not sort of a casual observer just watching what's happening, right? I don't think we should get too fancy, but in that sense, it's a little bit like quantum physics kind of stuff, right? We're like looking at politics, calling, you know, thousands of voters, right? For months on end, reporting about those results, and then having those results sort of spread by media outlets, on social media, digested by by political elites, by sort of armchair politics wonks, by journalists, right? So those things become part of sort of the churn of our politics. There are claims that some people lie on polls, the sort of the shy Trump voter. It's not clear there's a lot of evidence of that, but maybe people do that, right? There could be, you know, there could be some of that sort of happening. I think at the end, the polling was probably okay. Probably about as good as you get it. It's probably important that we think about how we approach and understand polling, that we understand that it's imperfect, that it really is you know, there are methods we can use that are better or worse, but there are always sampling errors and data errors and analysis errors that make it hard and messy. And also be aware of how polling's shaping our thinking and our behavior, right? Does it motivate us? Does it depress our willingness to act politically, so depress our efficacy? Yeah, and in particular right now, I would say on polls, we need to be really careful about exit polls right now. People are flashing exit polls about how Trump is doing strong with like Latino voters or Black voters or women or whatever. Remember, exit polls are people who went to go vote in person. A lot of folks didn't go to vote in person, right? Particularly sort of people of color and things like that, right? Who are most concerned about the corona. And so we need to be a little bit wary. We need to be basically smarter about big data and what big data means. I think this is not true. This is true not just of polling. I think it's true of like, we encounter lots of algorithms now in our daily lives, and we sort of are like, yeah, they're very accurate and reliable, and that it's science. But in fact, it's not that simple. It's like a little more complicated than that. The last thing I want to talk about two more things. The last thing is sort of a wrap up thing, right? I think the other big background to this whole sort of event is, of course, the pandemic, right? It's hard to ignore the role the pandemic has played in this election cycle. It obviously changed voting, right? So many people voted by mail-in ballot, people who maybe wouldn't have voted otherwise, but it came to their house, so they were able to request it to come to their house and fill it out and just send it in. And I think it changed a lot of perceptions how people sort of wanted to vote, right? It probably made Florida more competitive, Arizona more competitive, right? We know that coronavirus is particularly hard on people who are over 65, particularly if you have already have, you know, other conditions that could exacerbate it. And so, like, if the president sort of says, well, you know, the virus isn't real, the virus isn't dangerous, but you feel like it is real and it is dangerous and people you know got sick with it, you might sort of be like, I don't know if this is, you know, who I want to sort of vote for. In the closing days of the campaign, Trump was threatening to sort of fire, you know, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is, you know, involved with the task force and, you know, head of sort of National Institute for Health Organization, not the NIH itself, but one of the sub organizations, and has fought pandemics for, you know, 30 plus years. Fauci has, I think, better approval rating than the president, right? People like and trust Fauci. Not everyone, obviously. But yeah, so I think the pandemic both changed how the election happened, right? I mean, it meant the switch to mail-in ballots. It meant this sort of slowed down election day. And I think it also changed how some people thought about their vote, right? About what was important to them, right? It was one of the really big issues this sort of go around. People cited, right, as like, you know, the handling of the pandemic was something that was shaping their sort of vote, and some of the polling that people have sort of shared that we've sort of seen. I think the mail-in ballots were also important, of course, in what people were calling the red mirage and the blue shift, right? So on election day, Republicans were winning sort of big in lots of states, and then the mail-in ballots started to be counted and factored in, and that quickly sort of shifted and changed things. I think that's important thing to remember about polling too, is that this understanding of like how numbers are going to play out, how the election will play out, the sort of sequence of likely events changes it. But what's interesting is I think we're really bad at this. Like, I think a lot of people who were supporting Biden were really despondent on Tuesday night, right? Really despondent. They were hoping for big wins. And they were despondent for, I think, other reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. They thought they'd have a big win by like 10 p.m., right? That Biden would win North Carolina and Georgia handily, maybe even Florida, and then it was sort of over, right? Maybe something crazy like Ohio, right? And it would just sort of be like, oh, well, this is the end, right? And instead, right, it was closer, although, right, Biden seems to have pulled off a number of those wins, right? You know, it just took a little more work. All right. So, like, what does all this mean? Let's try to pull it together a little bit. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Obviously, we don't know what this all means. We don't have the final results yet. I think going back to what we just mentioned a second ago, how people wanted that sort of early night on Tuesday night, I think there was a lot of Americans, the millions who voted, right, on Tuesday, who wanted to see a really hard rejection of sort of what we might call Trumpism, the particular kind of racist, xenophobic, sexist brand of sort of hyper-capitalist conservatism that sort of is sort of like Donald Trump. And we didn't sort of see that. I think people hoped that just his like boorishness and, you know, his tax returns and his lack of curiosity about the job, he doesn't take it very seriously, combined with sort of horrendous policies like the putting children in cages and his mishandling of the pandemic and his insistence that it's all fake, that all these things would sort of lead people to sort of to reject Trump, right, if nothing else on sort of ethical or moral sort of grounds, and vote for Biden, a sort of centrist Democrat who's sort of well known for his kindness and decency, and right, there was a pretty interesting ad that the Lincoln Project ran, and the Lincoln Project was composed of sort of centrist Republicans who didn't like the president and sort of branched off to attack him through a series of quite clever YouTube commercials and ads. They ran an ad of Lindsey Graham a few years ago, right, talking just like endlessly kind things about Joe Biden. Like, Joe Biden's like the kindest man I've ever met, and some of the nicest things that's ever been said to me have been told to me by Joe Biden. And just like really like very sincere, and really laying it on thick, as we might say. So I think there was a lot of hope that sort of, you know, Biden's not radical policies and his general decency would lead a solid chunk, maybe not a majority, but a meaningful minority of Republicans to sort of say like, well, I prefer some of Trump's policies, but I don't know that he's competent for the job, intellectually or morally, and ergo, I will support Biden because, right, sort of, you know, country first, sort of, you know, patriotism over party kind of an argument. And that doesn't seem to be what happened. I mean, I'm sure some Republicans did, but it doesn't seem to be that was the broad sort of case. And I think in a lot of ways we shouldn't be surprised by that, right? For a couple of reasons. First off, parties are really, really powerful, at least in the American context. But they're not, but they are. Compared to German parties, American parties seem sad and weak, right? German parties have strong discipline, right? So party leaders, right, can like really demand votes from their legislators. Legislators tend to vote with their parties, do as they're told, or there's a pretty sort of rigid structure, and that's true in most parliamentary systems. And German parties, right, are really tight. You have many parties, right, and those parties are very focused. Not all of them, right? Some of them are broader coalitions, but you know, is the Pirate Party still a thing? Right, you had the Pirate Party for a while. It's not. That's a bummer. But you know, you have these some green parties, right? Things like that, right? I mean, we have a Green Party in the United States, but like, it's like 8 people in a basement. Right, that's not fair. There are thousands of them, right? And in some big cities, they might, you know, put up a meaningful challenge to like, you know, a state legislative seat or a city council seat or a county seat, something like that. But, you know, we don't have like a major sort of green party, a national or even regional across multiple states green party, not like that. So American parties in comparison seem weak, right? Members of parties are much more free agents. So people vote against their parties, less so today than, you know, a decade or two ago. But, you know, people will vote against their parties, perhaps most famously, right? Mitt Romney voted to, right, impeach the president, a historic first, right? No one from the president's parties ever voted, you know, to impeach him in the Senate or to convict, right, basically. So it does happen, but it's rare. That's rare. But so that's an example of how American parties can be weak, right? How members of parties kind of stand on their own, do their own thing. With that being said, while parties may be weak, and this is from Julia Azari, a really sharp political scientist out of Marquette, partisanship is strong, right? So your sense of being a Democrat or Republican in the United States, for many people, if not most people, is deeply tied to your sense of personal identity, right? Much like maybe your ethnicity or your religion or maybe your sort of a regional, like, you know, are you a New Yorker? Are you, you know, Appalachian? Are you, you know, an Ohioan through and through, you know? Much like those kinds of like categories, parties have that sort of power over us. And so people are like, you know, I'm a Republican, I vote Republican, that's just sort of what I am. I think in the case of Trump, this probably means that a lot of Republicans aren't really thinking about how Trump's policies impact the nation as a whole, in particular sort of marginalized people. They sort of brush that off. That's not great, but I think that's sort of what's going on. So that makes it hard to sort of just get rid of Trumpism, because in some ways people who aren't even maybe that into what Trump says go along with it because it has the right sort of party label. And to not go along with it, right, creates that tension, that cognitive dissonance in your head, and we'd rather avoid that. So it's just easier to sort of, right, focus on the things you agree with, ignore the rest, focus on why you don't like Joe Biden, and vote for him. But it's not just that you know, it's hard to sort of get rid of this sort of strain in American politics, because this strain is like not new to American politics, and it's really sort of baked in to American politics, right? Like racism is very much part of the American political story, right? You know, slavery, the Civil War, right? The 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, where slaves counted, right, for 3/5 of a person in the interest of congressional apportionment. So how many seats a state would get in Congress, essentially a way for Southern states to get additional representation from people who weren't even considered citizens or people in the norms of the time, right? As a way to sort of defend slavery, basically, right? The peculiar institution, as it was sometimes called. So right there in the Constitution, right there in the Constitution, we have these remnants of American slavery, American ideas about race. As long as you have xenophobia in the United States, right, making it hard for people to, you know, immigrate, sort of put up all kinds of barriers, legal and otherwise, to sort of immigration, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act, all sorts of right? And so you're not sort of going to get rid of that with one election, right? That requires a much deeper sort of political and cultural, economic even reckoning, right? Really thinking about like why we have these ideas, how far these ideas reach, how we start to, you know, untangle and pull them apart a little bit. But I think Biden's strong showing places like Texas, Arizona, Georgia, his ability to take back Michigan and Wisconsin, right, reminds us that there's a lot of resistance to these ideas as well. So I don't want to sort of be like, you know, America's done, right? It's over. Yeah. The American experiment has failed. I think that would be a rash sort of claim. I think, you know, people were concerned about what they saw, right? They were angry about it. They wanted something different, right? So that's good, but it also requires a more serious ongoing effort than one vote. That vote's important, but right, it requires, right, really strong discussions, reflections, and significant policy changes, right? So folks have easy, we mentioned voter suppression to start, right? There was like the Voting Rights Act, which was undone a few years back. We could, you know, make federal laws that gave it much more explicit instructions to states on what an election would look like, right? Number of booths, number of polling places, right? Ease of registration, stuff. Like we could do that. And we'll have to do that really at some point. And in fact, I think this whole process, as we see this slow sort of count, raises lots of questions about how we do our elections, right? The registration, the length of our election season, which is approximately 8,000 days. It feels like we have a really sort of long election cycle. The amount of money we allow in, our confusion and misunderstandings over things like mail-in ballots, and our inability to have a resource that people fully sort of trust, right? So conspiracy theory is also obviously the dark undercurrent of this election cycle. QAnon is sort of, that's the most prominent one. I'm sure there are others, right? How do people do, like, you know, trust the government, trust major media outlets? Like how does that start to happen? But when does counting start? That's another basic procedural efforts. And of course, the Electoral College itself, right, where it's the states that pick the winner, and it gives sort of additional advantages to small rural states. It overrides the popular vote. It's pretty undemocratic, right? It's a pretty undemocratic sort of way to elect a president. there are a lot of institutional problems that we have with our elections that should worry us, right? We should look at those and say, oh, these are a problem, right? It's really about recentering on the process of democracy and making democracy sort of the core value we care about, right? It's caring more about how is it done rather than like which party is going to win. And in thinking about how it's done, we should probably prioritize that everyone is able to vote easily and have their vote counted, right? But in fact, we see a lot of work to like get ballots thrown out, to have ballots not counted because they arrived late, to throw ballots out that the signatures don't match, right? So like, although again, it's like, that's a little terrifying. If you look at your signature twice in a row, like how much does it match? How did they do that? It seems like tea leaves. Maybe there is some sort of process, but you know, but it seems like the whole process feels like rickety, right? We have this sort of 19th century election process that assumed no sort of mass communication, no high-speed travel, poor roads, people living, thousands of miles apart. And now we have like, smartphones, right? And it's like, well, so maybe, right, the world is like a little different and we need an institution that reflects that sort of different reality. Because I think if we don't do that, we create these gaps in the system, right? Where like, for example, counting takes a long time and then the president sort of shows up and says, well, I win, right? I win. It's like, well, the votes aren't counted. Like, that's not great, right? And even the fact that the president would do that, again, suggests that undermining of votes, or that undermining of the process, right? Where the most important thing isn't democracy, but rather the party or me. I think democracies to some degree have to be other regarding, right? You have to view yourself as part of society, part of a collective endeavor. And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Hopefully we're all kind of shuffling forward together. And if that's not how you see it, if you see yourself as against other citizens, if you see other citizens as dangerous, that's a system that has a hard time holding together. I just want to note, this isn't sort of a thin call for like civility, but it's more about, right, really sort of like having a strong core about democratic values. So that's kind of where I think the election is, and I was sort of thinking about it. I'd happy to take questions or comments or anything like that and sort of talk about what's happening.
Okay, so thank you, first of all, for your very interesting talk. I think we all could learn a lot. And I would actually start the Q&A session now, like you suggested, and maybe ask you guys first if you have any questions you want to ask Professor Callen personally. We have a bunch of questions in the chat room. We received some via our registration form, but if you have any questions personally, please feel free to raise your blue hand and then you can ask him yourself. Yes, I see Tyler. Okay, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, Professor Callen. First off, thank you for talking. It's wonderful to see you. And it's very interesting to hear as I'm following along with the election. My question, I put it in the chat, but I'll ask it in person also, is Trump has already said that he will file lawsuits against 3 states. I believe it's Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Nevada. And is there enough that these lawsuits would be able to alter the outcomes of the election, or is it a last-ditch effort of Trump to try to rewrite the narrative surrounding this election as he has done, it seems, since election night started?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I just don't know. I don't know that the lawsuits are going to go anywhere. I think there's some talk from some experts that they're mostly baseless. There's not a lot of evidence of any sort of tampering or any sort of problem. I think they won a lawsuit this morning to have like access to the ballot watching, which they already had. I don't know that the lawsuits are going to matter a whole lot. My gut says that no, but I don't know. I'm not like, a guy who studies stuff like that, right? At all. That's not a very satisfying answer, I know, but that's the best I got.
Are there any other in-person questions, or should we move on to a question in the chat room maybe? Let's see. I'm just going to read a question from the chat room, maybe that will get the conversation started. From Frederica, actually, Trump demands to stop the counting before all postal ballots are counted. Is that legal? Can he get away with this? And now his supporters think that this is an appropriate demand.
So no, that is not sort of legal. If the ballots arrived on time and are ready to go, they should be counted. He can't really stop them, not through any sort of like legal sort of means. I guess he could sue in the courts, right? Like Tyler's question sort of alluded. He could sue in the courts to have some ballots not counted, say they were counted illegally, something like that. So yeah, that's sort of possible. But his order alone doesn't stop them, right? Ballot counting is a state level sort of endeavor. And what was the last part of that question, Alex?
The last part, right, isn't the chat, the last part was, can he get away with this? And now his supporters think that this is an appropriate demand.
Right. So maybe he can, I don't know if he can get away with it. He gets away with a lot of things, right, that don't seem like he should be able to do, that don't seem legal, right? Yeah, I don't know. It seems like the counts are carrying on though, right? Like it seems like no one's going to stop counting sort of anything. So, yeah.
Cassandra, do you want to take over maybe?
Okay, yeah. So there are no blue hands, so we continue with the questions in the chat. There's a question from Charlotte Borchert. She wrote, do you think Trump will demand any consequences if Biden wins the election? Can he demand anything else besides the recount of votes?
Yeah, no, he could demand the recount, I think, and that's sort of his that's sort of the one thing that he can really sort of demand. He can't sort of, we can't like hold the election again or anything like that. He could ask, again, with the lawsuits, that some votes not be counted, that some votes are not legal, they arrived late, they weren't mailed on time, right? Like something like that, or they weren't properly like vetted, right? So it's not clear that they're legitimate ballots, they weren't signed, they had some sort of mistake, right, on them, right? They weren't filled out properly. But that would be through sort of the court system, right? Yeah, that would be his sort of move.
Okay, so the next question, I'll just go through the chat room right now, but please feel free to raise your blue hand and ask Professor Callen yourself. The next question we see here is, are there any significant efforts to overcome the two-party system? In Germany, many people think it is one of the main causes for the bigger problems in the US.
So not really, right? We got these two parties. There's a couple of reasons why. First off, in the United States, we have first past the post, winner take all elections, which means that, right, the first party to get the plurality of the votes, so the most votes, wins the whole district or the whole state or whatever, depending on the scope of the race. So now that structure doesn't mean you only have to have two parties. It probably encourages two parties. And then once you have two parties and they're powerful, they sort of work to keep other parties off the ballots, right? Because, you know, if another left party develops, it siphons votes away from the Democrats, and then they're going to lose a lot of elections. There have been third parties that have had regional focus in the United States historically. New parties have emerged, right? We didn't always have like Republicans, right? It used to be Whigs. And then Whigs went away and they died out and they turned into Republicans. And so parties do come and go. There are third parties, right? Like Wisconsin used to have or Minnesota had like the Democratic, the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which was kind of a sort of progressive party of sort of radical farmers and unionists and things like that, right? And it was around for a long time, won local and state elections. I think they had a member of Congress at one point, right? So these things can happen, but in general, no, people are sort of really locked into their parties through personal preferences, through the actions of the parties, and the way that our system operates.
Okay, nobody's raising their hand, so everyone is welcome to also speak out in person. Then we continue with the questions in the chat. There's a question, is there a problem with the lack of strong election promises by the Democrats and running mostly on the dream to vote Trump out? Considering your work about the American infrastructure, should have Joe Biden, who is known for his passion for trains, ran on the promise to extend the American railway infrastructure as his main campaign promise, playing both the nostalgia and the eco-friendly card while also the jobs card, or maybe even new innovation like the Hyperloop?
So I think everyone should always be in favor of trains all the time. So I would have loved if Joe Biden would have run on sort of infrastructure and trains everywhere. I don't know why he didn't. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think probably if there's one thing that the Biden campaign really lacks, the most glaring thing was like sort of picking up a lot of key themes and running on them. I think their big theme was sort of like decency, right? That was like, right, like let's be sort of like decent again. Let's be America again. And that was good. But yeah, you sort of do wonder, right, if you had sort of run on like, you know, infrastructure, right, would that have made like a big sort of difference, right? Or anything, right? I think that's a really, yes, I think that's sort of right. That's what he needed to do. That would really have helped pick up maybe just those few voters here and there that might have ended this a little bit sooner, right? I think a lot of people didn't see the plans are out there, right? There's like the Green New Deal, right? That's a thing that people have been talking about, right? So how do we do rail projects and solar projects, right? Puts people to work, funds research labs, and gets us clean energy, right? Sort of it seems like a win-win-win. And so it's like, that's an obvious one where it's like, the idea is there, just pick it up, right? Just pick it up and sort of, right, go with it.
All right. Next question is actually from our former TA Zeverin. I'm going to read it from the chat. Trump's presidency has given new form to the concept of political scandal. Despite these many scandals, many voters seem to approve of his style of political leadership. Do you share the concern that Trump will not remain an exception, but that candidates and presidents will copy this format in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there is a concern, right? The sort of appeal to like, you know, populism, demagoguery, right? Just saying whatever you want because it sounds good. That's absolutely a concern. I think, you know, democracies require, again, a sense of trust, right? And the sense of like decency, including from leaders, right? That they're going to do their best to be generally transparent and generally honest, right? And generally respect other opposition party members, right? Otherwise, it quickly descends into sort of chaos. I think one possibility, though, is that Trump might be not exactly a one-off figure, but a semi-unique figure, right? He is a bit of a showman, right? It is sort of his deal. He has a kind of sort of charisma that appeals to a lot of people, right? He's a businessman. He's like, he's on TV, and he's a reality show star. He's been famous for a long time. He's got high name recognition since the 80s, right? You know, he's been this sort of flashy mogul kind of guy. It's not clear that there's another person in the wings quite like Trump, though I think they could borrow pieces of the playbook, right? I think they could borrow pieces of the playbook, right? And that is worrisome, but also probably not the first time these things have happened, right? So yeah. So yes and no, I think is my answer.
Okay, the next question here in the chat function comes from Moritz. And he asks, do you think that there is a high chance of the Supreme Court ruling in Trump's favor?
That's a good question. I don't know. So like, yeah, so if like a ballot question got that high, that's always sort of a chance. But like, I don't know, honestly, right? I'm not a courts person. He obviously appointed 3 of them. There's some other friendly justices on there. On the other hand, the court is not insensitive to political sort of decision-making broadly. And, right, they know that Bush v. Gore wasn't popular. It was sort of written as a one-off, not a precedent kind of decision. Like, right, they sort of say in it, don't be, like, using this, right, anymore for other stuff. And it's possible they would see like if they might see it as a move towards delegitimacy if they were sort of to make that decision, and that might stay their hand. The Supreme Court of our institutions in the United States depends the most upon that goodwill of legitimacy, right? It doesn't have a lot of power. It doesn't have, you know, money it controls or executive authority, so power over the bureaucracy to enforce rules or give out favors. It really depends on a sense that it's like trustworthy. And if it's not, that's a really big blow to how our institutions operate.
Next question is a question somebody wants to ask you in person. So Louis Kepler, you're up next. Can you unmute yourself?
Hello, Professor Callen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My question is not really concerning the election, not necessarily, but President Trump's record. So as a foreigner from Germany, I can only judge his domestic policy and withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and that's things that I would not vote for him on. So I can only conclude that his domestic policy has to be somehow that good for his voters, that they stayed on his side, since he emphasized America first back in 2016. So how is his domestic performance? Can you give your opinion on that?
I think that's a great question. I think, you know, his domestic performance depends on who you are, obviously, how it affects you. I think it's okay in some ways for his supporters. People talk a lot about the economy. So the stock market went up a lot while he was president. So if your 401k is doing a little better or whatever, that in that sense, you might say, yeah, we're sort of doing sort of better. Of course, domestic policy would also include the pandemic, and there things are like not so good, right? We hit 100,000 infections yesterday. So that's not exciting. So in that sense, that has not been good, but that came late to his core base, right? There was some evidence that, right, when it was hitting New York really hard, when it was still early, it could have been contained, that the administration was like, well, New York and New York City in particular is never going to vote for me, so I'm not going to help them, which is a sort of terrifying position. I also would point out, so I think in some ways, yeah, and I think there were subsidies for farmers and things like that, sort of really traditional, like sort of political sort of payouts that sort of happened, right? I don't know that, but some of things didn't pan out. There wasn't a revival of fracking or coal digging, right? Coal mining, I guess. There wasn't a huge manufacturing boom. That was something that was published as well, right? I would also point out that like part of what you might get out of it isn't always material, right? So if people have this sense of identity reaffirmed, right? Their sense of what America is supposed to be, right? This sense of like feeling powerful vicariously, right? Of being able to like upset people who, you know, care about, you know, gay people or trans people or people of color, right? That could be a huge part of it too. That could be what they're getting.
Thank you.
All right, I'm looking in the
Yeah.
chat.
I think Lisa has a question. She just raised her hand. She's next. Lisa, from our colleague from the international office.
Yes, hello. Also from Cologne. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting insight into US politics. That was very interesting and yeah, very up to date at the moment. So hopefully tomorrow we will get some more information on who is president of the United States. I don't know. We'll see. So my question is more looking into the future, and it's actually also in terms of Severin's question in advance a bit. So what do you think will be like the long-term effects of Trump's presidency for a society? You know, I have the feeling of that it will have an effect on people in the long term and on society and on, I don't know, economy, etc. So that would be very interesting to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question about the long-term impact. I think one long-term impact is that it will sort of make a lot of these tensions around like race and region and class, right, really sort of heighten. Like that's not sort of going away. And I think there will be a lot of questions, I think, about potentially what to do with America on the international stage, right? Like, I just feel like we seem really volatile right now, right? You know, we go from sort of George W. Bush to Barack Obama to Donald Trump to whatever's next. And it sort of seems like, right, it seems like, you know, are we reliable? You know, we removed ourselves from the Paris Accords formally, right? Yesterday, today, whatever it was, right? And so I think there will be these long-term effects. And I think also in particular, I think there's been a real undermining of institutions, right? The press, right? Bureaucrats, right? You know, so like the CDC now is seen as like, can we trust it, right? And so I think all these things matter in terms of state capacity, the capacity of state to do things, so we're gonna reach out and impact people's lives. And so I think that's where you're gonna see the biggest impact is sort of these sort of rising conflicts and this sort of degradation of American national capacity, right? As people sort of don't believe what they're told, won't listen to what experts ask them to do.
All right, so I see that Tyler has his hand back up. I will just ask one question from the chat room first because it's been here a little bit longer. It's from our alumna from Mexico. Laura, do you think that there is any possibility of making a deception through the votes sent by mail?
No, right, no. So voting by mail in the United States is incredibly secure, right? And so there's no sort of sense that like votes sent by mail are sort of compromised in any way. And there sort of never sort of has been, and even right now with counts, there's no sense that any sort of fraud has been going on from sort of official reports, right? So vote by mail is A-okay.
Thank you. So Tyler, you're up next.
You talked earlier in your talk about voter turnout, and from everything I'm hearing, turnout is record in many states. I believe in Massachusetts, my home state, it's close to 1.5 times the record before, and there are counties in Pennsylvania that are breaking records left and right. And I'm wondering, what can American politics, I guess both parties, do to keep voters interested and keep turnout high and get Americans to the polls, which is something that has been tough in the past couple of elections?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one is the thing we started with is making it easier to vote. It's hard not to imagine that mail-in voting wasn't part of this, right? You request a ballot, it comes to your house, you fill it out, put it in an envelope, doesn't even need a stamp, right? And it gets taken back, right? So like making it easier to vote, right, is a huge part. Easy to register, easy to get your ballot, easy to sort of send it in. I think folks interested in politics is sort of harder. I think probably you need a system that feels more representative, right? That if you vote, right, something happens. That's about institutions, right? Like, you know, things like the Electoral College and winner-take-all districts don't feel representative in the same way that, say, a parliamentary system or, might feel that way, right? Proportional representation might sort of feel, right? And also different kinds of voting systems, ranked choice voting, right? Things like that. There's lots of things we could do that you can see, well, I may not have won, but I got something. I think that's really important too. So to actually make the voting system work better.
We still have another question. I'm referring also to the one with the deception through mail. It's just an addition by somebody else. Is voting by mail more complex? Are the chances higher that a ballot will not be counted because a voter made a mistake?
Yeah, that's a great sort of question. I don't know a ton about this part, right? I know a little bit, so don't think this is gospel. You should definitely Google this one a little bit. So voting by mail is not super hard, right? It comes to your house, right? There's instructions in it. It looks just like a regular ballot. It's a paper ballot. You unfold it. It's got, you know, what you're voting for, the names, little bubbles, like, right? You fill them in, fold it up. It goes in the envelope, right? And that goes in, right? In Pennsylvania, you have to put it like in a sealed envelope, and then you put it in the mailing envelope. So it's double, right? Double envelope. If you don't put it in that first secret envelope, it's called a naked ballot, and it could be invalid. There are concerns, people make mistakes, particularly first-time voters in mail-in ballots, because you do have to like sign it in a particular place, and some states require you to have a witness sign it, and there's a couple of different things that you have to sort of do. And the witness can just be like, like your neighbor, right? It's not like, an official, right? So there's these different sort of rules, but in general, it's very doable and very easy, but you do have to do it correctly, right? Like do the 2 envelopes. There are sometimes ballots that are rejected because the signatures don't match. Those ballots can be cured. So if there's a website that'll say, hey, Zach, your ballot didn't match. And then if you can prove that's your ballot, it can be stuck back in, right? So it's not like, there are ways to get around some of the problems that might emerge. So no, mail ballots are not especially sort of risky or like temperamental. I guess temperamental maybe is the word.
All right, I see one more question in the chat, so I'll read that real quick. Should the electoral term be extended, considering the first year is mostly used writing the laws for the next years, and the last election year on running for the next election term?
That's actually a great question. There are some arguments out there. There's this great book called Relic by William Howell and I don't know who the other person is, someone else, a co-author, I forget. But one of Howell's really central arguments is to have a single 6-year presidential term, right? Which some other countries have, right? So some people argue that we should have like a prime minister, right? Fold the executive into the legislative branch. Howell et al. Argue, well, no, the tension between the executive and the legislative can have some values, right? But what we could do is take out re-election, right? You get a 6-year term. You get, much like senators, right? You get a little more time to get some work done. You're not up for re-election, so that you can really focus on making the best choices, I think is the idea, rather than trying to worry about re-election. So yeah, I think there are ways. I think if we had a longer term, we would want to have probably the single term limit. 12 years is a long time to be president. It's a long time for a country. It's a long time for an individual, right? If you see sort of people who like Barack Obama, when he goes into office and when he comes out, he ages about 20 years, right? Over those 8 years, right? That's a pretty common thing that happens. Look at pictures of George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush, right? There's great footage of him on like inauguration day, and he's like bouncing around. And 4 years later, he doesn't look so bouncy. Because, right, it's hard, right? It's like a 20-hour-a-day job, right? And so there are good arguments for term limits and a longer term.
I think we have somebody having a question. Paul, wherever you are, please have your question.
Hello, Mr. Callen. Now, I've heard that there are some self-appointed militias, and I guess I should call them extremist rights, who say that they wouldn't accept Trump losing the election and that they would cause a riot. Do these groups actually pose a danger, or is this actually just tough talk, so to say?
Could you repeat that last part for me again?
Do these groups actually pose a danger to the election, or is this just basically smoke and mirrors, so to say?
Right. So yeah, there are these groups, right? And so, right, America has a tradition of sort of vigilantism, right? As when it comes to sort of our political justice, right? It's often deeply problematic and deeply racist, right? To slaves, to free African Americans, later citizens, to Latinos in the Southwest. And so militias are kind of a modern version of that same idea. People call themselves sovereign citizens who like have special powers by their sort of birthright and like can interpret the Constitution. It's a very complicated sort of set of ideas. Has its own sort of norms and histories and secret codes and everything. And I think they are a real threat, right? Like, I think, you know, they've been sort of like, but not to the election, right? Just to be clear. I think the election will be carried out. You know, they're not going to stop counting or anything like that. But I do think they are a threat to sort of like overall stability. That, you know, particularly because of the internet, where they can find each other and connect and mobilize and organize. They can show up at places and, you know, disrupt events and hurt and kill people. And they are well armed and they are armored in some cases, right? And so they become sort of dangerous, right? I think it is a worrisome sort of trend when essentially citizens take over official functions, and it almost always ends badly for people who are without power, marginalized groups, right? Because generally that's who they're sort of directing their sort of rancor at. And, you know, yeah, there's a long history of that in the American context, and this fits really into that groove.
Okay, so I think we answered all the questions.
I think Tyler has another question. His hand is raised.
Hi. Yeah, so I actually have two questions. But the first one is with the Supreme Court, if it does reach the Supreme Court, what does the timeline look like for that? Like, how long will we be waiting on a final result then of the election? And my second question is I've been following along as best I can to the media, and they're talking a lot about the blue wall of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania Trump took in 2016. How important is it for Democrats to get these three states back? And what did they do differently between these two campaigns of Hillary in 2016 and Biden in 2020 to really swing those states from all three going to Trump to possibly all three going for Biden again?
Yeah, so I think the Supreme Court question, I don't know what the timeline would be. That's a really great question. Probably fast. I think the courts would move, not like fast, but reasonably quickly, right? So like if state courts were like, no, and then Trump sues, I think the Supreme Court would take it up very sort of quickly, right? I mean, you know, Bush v. Gore wasn't happening in like April or something, right? You know, it happened pretty quick. So that's sort of my sort of guess. And then the second question was about, the blue wall. Yeah. So I think, you know, I think some of it was there was a lot of work in those states by activists. I think that's really important. We can't downplay that, right? There was really great turnout, like in Detroit, for instance, right? That sort of got this done. I think we cannot downplay, in particular, like, you know, like African-American voters like showed up, right? In Philadelphia too. But there was a lot of work that was going on there by sort of on the ground sort of activists, right? And I think also Biden made those a priority. He visited those states a lot. He's from Pennsylvania, of course. He was born here, grew up here, but he visited those states a lot. I think Clinton didn't visit them at all or very little, took them sort of for granted. Now, in her defense, she was polling pretty well there, right? Well enough. She thought that, you know, history would hold. But yeah, I think that was the difference, right? Is that people sort of got motivated, right? Also, I think Biden was just a different candidate, right? I think Hillary Clinton never broke the 50% sort of mark, right? In terms of like people liking her. She had a history. Maybe all that wasn't fair, right? A lot of it was misogyny for sure. I think we shouldn't discount that, right? But she had this history. She, you know, her and Bill Clinton had been tarnished for 20 some odd years by sort of conservatives as having murdered people. Not true. And all sorts of other things, right? And she had sort of like, there was a lot of baggage with her candidacy, which I think is that sort of chunk of undecided voters that made a big difference in 2016. So, that we didn't have this time.
Thank you. We have one more question coming in from the chat. What do you think about the impact of education on the elections? Do you think Trump would have as many votes if the American education system would have been different or more accessible? I think sometimes it seems like Trump voters just don't see the whole picture. Is that just because the media shows it like that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So often I think we fall back on education to explain things, or also to solve problems, right? Which is to educate people. And that's not wrong, but it's also a little unsatisfying. I don't know that it can fix everything. But in this case, I think there are some places where education can make a real difference, right? Because you think about dealing with like misinformation, right? So to understand how the political system works, how decisions are made, the powers of the executive, it would be way more useful, I think, if our voters were sort of better informed. How to make sense of bad information from good information in the media, right? That everything is like rigged, there's no evidence of that, or how viruses spread, right? You know, I think to have some basic information that we could evaluate policies on, evaluate suggestions from government on. I think in this case, education might make a sort of critical difference, right? You still might get a Trump, but they might not do as well or be able to push as far, and that would be meaningful for lots of people.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat right now or a raised hand, so I actually have a question myself for you, Professor Callen. So there have been a lot of social unrest, I would say, prior to the elections with the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, or the counter protests. Would you say, would that social unrest kind of calm down with, say, President Biden, or what would you say is the forecast there?
I don't think so. Maybe a little, but not as much as we think, because a lot of those things stem from local conflicts that are also long simmering. So like Black Lives Matter, right? You know, Black Americans have been pushing against American police for, 200 years more, right? And those things have sort of reached a sort of head, both in terms of Black Lives Matters reaching sort of a critical mass of supporters, and I think social media blowing up these events when they sort of happen, these sort of police brutality incidents, and people's sort of overall frustration with them, right, has sort of reached a sort of like, it doesn't mean it'll be fixed or resolved, but I don't know that just the presence of Biden will sort of fix it, right? It's possible the presence of Biden cools things down enough that you get to see real reform and changes, right? Maybe some like investigations of police departments by the Justice Department, maybe a willingness to like talk about why these things are happening rather than just demonizing protesters, try to talk about root causes, to frame the conversation a little bit differently. That might be useful, but yeah, I don't know that you're going to see like an end to this sort of social unrest.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have more questions? There are no more questions in the chat room. I don't see any, so if there's anyone wanting to pose the question, this is the time now. But if everything is answered, I don't know.
There is a question. Zeverin has a question. Go right ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Professor Callen, for sharing so much of your insight about these election. And I also want to use that opportunity to say hi to the Allegheny and to the Cologne family. So my question refers like further up to the future, because I talked to many Americans who seem to disapprove with the system of the winner takes it all, or the electoral college itself. Do you see a tendency that political parties might favor that idea of like getting more into a system of the popular vote instead of like having like the winner takes it all principle? Yeah.
I think people are talking about it really seriously, and they have been for a few years. That's good. I think it's probably a long-term process to changing it.
Yeah.
I think Democrats would be interested in it, though there are some Democrats who are like, it works fine. It's what we've got. It's, that it makes sure small states have a voice. Some people believe that really strongly, not in a cynical way, but, it's good to have states have the votes, because otherwise we would all ignore Nebraska. Even though Nebraska doesn't hardly factor into the election anyway, there's at least some sense that they matter a little bit more, and that somehow is just. Republicans are relying heavily on the Electoral College and the structure of the Senate to maintain their power. So I think they have very little interest in it, and they still have enough representation, both at the state and federal level, that I don't think this is going forward for a long time. So we sort of have the Electoral College. But I do think it's interesting that the conversation is happening and sort of trickle down to like regular people, right? Not just sort of academics or hardcore policy people or politicians. It's like regular folks who have some interest in politics are like, knows what electoral college is, understand how it biases the vote system, understand how there's other models out there, right? And there are some changes that could take off, right? Nebraska and Maine both split their electoral college votes, right? Maine is going to have like ranked choice voting now, right? So there are these other models. Now, Nebraska's had the split electoral vote for like decades, a couple decades, maybe at least 10 years more. So it hasn't caught on fire, but now Maine does it. So maybe it'll take off. And so there could be modifications, even if we don't get rid of it, to like divide the electoral college by congressional district, who wins each congressional district, or to divide it by the state, the proportion of the state vote, right? There are things that we could imagine doing that, would matter.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions in the chat, or nobody's raising his hand. So, well, thank you very much for Professor Callen for giving me a talk and answering all the manifold questions that so many people have had here. And of course, you will have still a long day ahead of you, and probably you will be keeping your eyes on the media channels, and we here over in Germany, we will do it as well. Thank you very much again for doing this, and also thank you very much for the colleagues back at Allegheny College for making this exchange program that successful. And I think the fact that so many of our Cologne students who once went to Allegheny College are here today. And you were talking, Severin, about your Cologne family. I think this also shows that this is a very worthwhile relationship which we do have between our two institutions. So thank you. And of course, to all our alumni all over the world, thank you so much for joining in again on our third alumni talk. And please keep in touch. We will think about new talks which we could organize with you. And if you have any wishes or ideas, just let us know. And yes, having said all that, from my side, thank you and have a good day or a good night wherever you are. Alexandra, you want to add something?
I think you've said it all. Thank you so much, Professor Callen, for agreeing to give a talk. Thank you, Allegheny College, to Cinda, Lene, Felix, for sharing, and for the corporation. I enjoyed it, and I hope we answered, or Professor Callen answered all of your questions. I think there are so many more questions, but for tonight, I think, yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And to everybody else, have a good night, a good day, wherever you are. Maybe you'll join us next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.
Thank you. We enjoyed it very much. Goodbye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.